David Benatar is a professor of philosophy and head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa. He's best known for his advocacy of antinatalism in his book Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. What is antinatalism and how did you arrive at this position?
Well, antinatalism can be understood in a variety of different ways, but broadly speaking, it's an opposition to bringing new beings into existence. That would apply to humans, but it would also apply to animals by breeding them, for example. How I came to this position? Well, the world seems an ugly place and life seems pretty hard, and so I don't know why we would inflict more of that on others.
You know the history of the term at all?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether I coined the term or whether I came across it before, so I'm really not sure of that.
But you eventually came to write your own book on the topic.
Better Never to Have Been.
Yes.
That's correct. I wrote an earlier article on it, and then developed the ideas in much more detail in that book, which was first published in 2006.
So human societies could be said to be hugely pro-natalist, and there's such some question whether you are serious or just having fun with a ludicrous concept, as with the voluntary human extinction movement. Are you sincere on this issue?
I am sincere. I am entirely serious about it. I think you're correct that many societies are pro-natalist, although there are some that are anti-natalist in a moderate sense. So there have been some societies, like China, for example, that have tried to curtail the human population growth. So they don't adopt the radical view that I'd adopt, that all procreation is wrong, but they've certainly attempted to restrict procreation, and in that sense they've been somewhat anti-natalist.
The television drama True Detective's first season is said to have been influenced by your work. How did you feel about the way they broached the topic?
Well, I actually was asked to write a little article about that recently, which appears on a website called The Critique. And I noted there that the one character, Russ Cole, is an anti-natalist, but he's a variety of other things as well. And so what I tried to do in that piece was to differentiate his anti-natalism from other features of his character, including, for example, his alcoholism. So I don't think that being an anti-natalist commits you to being an alcoholic, for example.
So, in this episode, our two other guests are Mistro and Jan, and they've also expressed their antinatalism and as well as veganism through the mediums of music and fictional novels, respectively. What do you feel about this, and would you urge that other like-minded people also become active?
I don't see myself so much as an activist. I certainly think there's a role for activism, a place for activism, but I think different people are suited to different roles, and I'm just not sure I'm very good as an activist. But I think that antinatalism is an important idea. I think the most effective way that any individual can avoid the suffering of others. And so I think there are a variety of ways in which people might spread that message. The True Detective was one example. I'm not familiar with the work of these guests you've mentioned, but those other mediums would certainly be other ways of conveying the message, and that seems all to the good for me.
So, ethicist Peter Singer concluded an article about you saying he believes that most people have lives worth living. Many people feel they are lucky to be alive and that life will be similarly good for their offspring. What would you say to them?
Well, I think, as I've noted before, there's an ambiguity in that claim that life is worth living. So one thing you might mean is that life is worth continuing, but another thing you might mean is that life is worth starting. And I don't think that those things either mean the same or that the same standards apply to whether a life is worth starting and a life is worth continuing. So we're all here at the moment. Our lives have already started. And questions about whether we should end our life are, I think, very different questions from questions about whether we should start lives that are like ours. And the reason for that is that once you exist, you actually have an interest in continuing to exist. That interest could be defeated if the quality of life gets really, really bad at a certain point. But before you exist, if you never exist, there's no interest in coming into existence, and so there's nothing to defeat. And that's why I think we need to apply a much higher standard when we're making decisions about lives worth starting than when we're making decisions about lives worth continuing. And so I think a lot of people are glossing that distinction. They're ignoring that distinction, which is a crucial one.
And I think there have been studies as well to show that once we are here, we have an optimism bias.
In general, humanity does have an optimism bias, and there's been a vast amount of psychological literature that has demonstrated that. Of course, it's not true of every last individual. There are some individuals who are more realistic, and they tend to be less happy than the ones that have the optimism bias.
Have you heard any rational, non-selfish reasons for adding new humans, and what is the strongest argument you've heard?
Rational, non-selfish reasons. It depends on, I think, what you mean by a non-selfish reason. Often when people procreate, they say they're doing it for the state or for some community's preservation, and it's not clear whether these are really altruistic reasons or whether they're just a kind of broader selfish reason. In other words, it's not just about my interests, but about the interests of my group. So I think you could construe those in different ways. I don't think that breeding in order to continue a community is a good enough reason either. I mean, I certainly understand the desire that people have for their communities to endure through time, for there to be new generations practicing communal practices and continuing communal ways of life. But I'm really not convinced that those would outweigh the immense suffering of the people who are brought into existence. I certainly don't think that we can be non-altruistic in terms of bringing somebody else into existence. In other words, I don't think that we benefit the person who we bring into existence. I think that person is always, in fact, harmed.
So have you encountered any arguments that you believe to be quite strong or that stumped you temporarily?
There have been a range of arguments. They tend to have, the better ones, let's put it this way, tend to try to justify some kind of optimism. And I think there are serious arguments. It's not like they've worried me in the sense that caused me to doubt the antinatalist position, but they've certainly required careful counter-argument. And I think that's a pleasing development because the initial responses to the book were very dismissive, very perfunctory, very unfair, and there are still many of those sorts of responses, ones that are ad hominem, they attack the author rather than the arguments. And so when one does get serious arguments that try to engage one, I think that's a good thing, and where I can, I've tried to respond. The volume, of course, is too much now. I just can't reply to everybody, but I'm trying where I can to reply to the argument.
So what of the retort suggesting that antinatalists should walk the talk and kill themselves?
Well, either they haven't read what I originally said, or they need to come up with an argument for why antinatalism does commit you to suicide, because I've specifically argued that antinatalism does not commit you to suicide. Certainly not immediately. I think that life can get so bad that it may be rational to take your own life. But because that time might come in your life, doesn't mean to say that you ought to take your life now. It might be rational instead to wait until the quality of life has deteriorated to that point. But if you're thinking about whether you should start a life, you need to recognize that that life will include, very likely include, periods of that terrible suffering, and will then pose that person with a very serious dilemma about whether to continue to live or whether to take their own life. And that in itself, I think, is a very unfair thing to inflict on other people.
You're listening to The Species Barrier on 107.3 Siren FM.
Given our disproportionate impacts on the planet and other animals, do you believe misanthropy to be a rational position?
Well, I have recently defended misanthropy as one possible basis for antinatalism. In that earlier book that you mentioned, Better Never to Have Been, the arguments were all of what I call a philanthropic kind. So they were all based out of concern for the human beings that are brought into existence. But I've subsequently argued that there are also very good misanthropic arguments against bringing people into existence. And that is because, first of all, of the damage that humans do to one another, but also because of the damage that they do to other sentient beings on the planet. And I don't think that philanthropy and misanthropy in these senses are incompatible. And I do say something about why I think that's the case. I think that you can both be concerned about human beings as victims and also recognize them as perpetrators of injustices and other evils on one another and on other beings.
So almost reclaiming the word misanthropy as something other than a pejorative and a slur, because it can be a rational position to hold.
Yes, indeed. So, I think there can be misguided forms of misanthropy. So let's imagine somebody were universally misanthropic and they loathed every last human they encountered, and there was no nuance in their position. They couldn't differentiate between milder forms of human weakness and more severe forms of human evil. Then that would be a form of misanthropy that I would not defend. But I do think that humans are a destructive species, and we need to recognize that. We need to be a bit more humble about that. Even when we try to minimize the impact, the negative impact that we have on the world, it's very hard for us to get it to zero.
You took place in the South African TED Talk event, Should Meat Be Off the Menu? What are your thoughts on humans breeding sentient animals into existence in order to exploit and kill them?
I think it's an absurd and evil idea. I don't know how anybody could justify bringing a sentient being into existence in order to inflict suffering on it and then to take its life so that you could derive pleasure from eating its flesh. I've heard lots of arguments, as I'm sure you have, for why this is acceptable, but it just seems to me to be a patently evil idea.
So you're a vegan, are you?
I am. People often want to ask, do you live by these principles? And imagine I didn't. I think the arguments would stand by themselves, but I am in fact a vegan.
So what are your thoughts on veganism and how we generally impact other animals?
Well, there are a host of negative ways in which we impact on other animals. They're obviously via the food industry, where we are producing, sometimes reproducing, breeding these animals, and then treating them badly, and then killing them. Even if we look at the fish in the ocean, which are harvested, we haven't bred those, but we inflict immense suffering on them. There's immense suffering in the research industry. Via our impact on the climate, we are negatively affecting both humans and animals. So I think there are lots of ways in which we're very damaging.
Do you advocate extinction for all other sentient animals as well? We obviously drive 200 species extinct daily, and would further human intervention to this end be moral?
Well, I draw the distinction between different ways of bringing about extinction. So I'm all in favor of extinction via non-procreation, but I'm not in favor of extinction by killing. So I don't think we should go around killing large numbers of human beings. I don't think we should go off killing animals in order to make them extinct. But non-procreation is, I think, the right route to extinction. So I'm not worried about a planet that does not have any sentient life. In fact, I think a planet of that kind would be much better than a planet like ours, which is just filled with suffering, both human and non-human animal. So I'm not worried about extinction per se, but the means may be worrying.
So we've established that it might be wrong to breed domesticated animals into existence, but would you advocate sterilizing free-living animals, for example?
Yes. Now, obviously, there are some issues of welfare concerned with sterilization because it's not a pain-free experience for that animal. There's going to be some post-operative pain. There may be other implications for animal welfare. But I think if we do this in the best possible way, that is far preferable to many more animals being bred, many more companion animals being bred.
A human pregnancy is commonly seen as a cause of celebration and congratulations. How do you react to such announcements?
That's a hard one because people want one to be pleased for them when they tell you that they're pregnant. And I do feel in the sadness at the thought that there'll be another being that will come into existence and very likely suffer quite considerably. But what I sometimes try to do to be tactful is to distinguish between my pleasure for the expectant parent and my concern for the resultant child. I don't always express the latter part, depending on how well I know somebody, but I might say I'm happy for you.
Yeah, I've started being very factual about it in that instead of saying congratulations, I'll say, oh, how far along are you? So because obviously you don't want to offend someone, you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, but at the same time,
Yes.
I feel like I'd be lying to say congratulations.
Exactly. I think, well, that's a very tactful method that you've employed, and I'm sure there are a range of others that one could use. So we do obviously need to be aware of the sensitivities of people who are procreating, be aware that they've not thought about these issues to the extent that we might have, that they might have different views, and we, I think, without compromising our principles, can engage civilly with them.
You must be greatly frustrated by parents not considering these issues in advance of becoming pregnant.
Yes, indeed. I've seen research that about 50% of people who were brought into existence without a decision being made to bring them into existence. They were just the result of sexual intercourse, and that's probably the most troubling, where somebody didn't particularly want a child. In other situations, people have deliberated and they've chosen, and my own view, of course, is that they've chosen wrongly, but at least in those situations there's been some deliberation about it, and one hopes that they're then better equipped to make that child's life as devoid of suffering as is humanly possible. Now, I don't think that as humanly possible is ever good enough, but clearly there are some lives that are much worse than others, and unplanned children are sometimes cared for very well, but certainly unwanted children are going to have the rawest deal.
You've worked on the issue of pain in fetuses. What were your findings, and do you consider abortion to be moral if the alternative is bringing a new human into existence?
So yes, I worked on that topic with one of my brothers who's a neurologist, so we tried to combine the philosophical and the neurological interests there. And the conclusion that we came to, and this was not original research, it was really looking at existent evidence, was that fetuses likely begin to feel pain around 27, 28 weeks of gestation, in that vicinity. Now, I don't think that antinatalism commits you to abortion before that point, but I think if you combine certain views about the status of a pre-sentient fetus with antinatalism, then you might be led to the conclusion that abortion would be preferable prior to sentience. I think once the fetus becomes sentient, it now acquires some moral standing, some moral considerability, and then matters become more complicated. So I would not suggest that abortion is never justified later on in pregnancy. There may well be circumstances where it would amount to a kind of euthanasia, where the being that will result will suffer so much that even though it's already got some moral status, and even though it may already have some interest in continuing to exist, we should still terminate its life. But I do want to emphasize the point that antinatalism does not commit you to a certain view on abortion. You have to combine antinatalism with other views about the status, the moral status of a fetus. My own view, given my views about fetal moral status, is that at the pre-sentient point it would be better to abort than not to abort. But I don't think that all antinatalists have to adopt that same view if they have different views about moral status of fetuses than I do.
So where can people find out more about your work?
Probably the best place is to look at that book, Better Never to Have Been. I also co-authored a book recently called Debating Procreation with David Wasserman from the United States. I write half of the book in which I defend the antinatalist position, and he writes the other half where he argues against me. So there you could see some of the arguments for the contrary position. There are also some more popular pieces that I've written about antinatalism for those who don't want to wade through a full book. And I believe those can be found on a website linked to my name on the philosophy department at the University of Cape Town website. So there have been various pieces, I think, in like the Philosopher's Magazine and other places. One other thing I should say is that in the book Better Never to Have Been, I do give a kind of reader's guide where I tell the reader which parts could be skipped if you wanting to avoid the more technical arguments.
Is there anything else that we haven't mentioned that you'd like to go into?
No, I think you've asked a lot of great questions.